Clyde Ashgrove had been wrong exactly once in 43 years of farming. That one time nearly killed him. But this story is not about the time Clyde was wrong. This is about the time no one would listen. He walked the north edge of his property at 5:15 in the morning, the second week of February 2022. The sky had not committed to daylight yet. It hung in that gray space between night and suggestion, the kind of light that makes a man look like a shadow moving across his own land. Clyde carried no tools, no phone, just a notebook in the chest pocket of his canvas jacket, the same brand of notebook he had been buying from the farm supply store in town for over 4 decades. The pages were unlined. He preferred it that way. Lines suggested that someone else knew how his thoughts should be organized. He stopped at the fence post that marked the northeast corner of his second section, knelt, took a handful of soil and brought it close to his face. He squeezed it, rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, held it under his nose. The top layer had begun to soften with the earliest hints of thaw, but beneath that first inch, the ground was still holding winter tight, the way a man holds a grudge he is not ready to let go of. Clyde opened the notebook, wrote 2 lines, closed it, stood, kept walking. 43 years on 400 acres of Kendrick Valley ground had taught Clyde something that no university ever published and no satellite ever photographed. The valley had a personality, not the loud kind, not the kind that showed up on a weather map or in a county soil survey, the kind that only revealed itself to someone who had been paying the right kind of attention for long enough to notice things that happened slowly or rarely, or only under conditions that most people never stayed around long enough to see. He knew that a frost pocket formed in the north section of the valley every year, beginning in the 3rd week of April, with a consistency that the regional weather data never captured because the regional weather station sat 12 miles away on lower ground. The station measured the region. Clyde measured the valley. They were not the same thing. He knew that heavy clay sat beneath the apparently workable topsoil in the northeast fields. Clay that behaved like a cooperative partner in a dry spring, accepting seed and preparation with no complaint, and turned into something close to concrete in a wet one, compacting under the very equipment that was supposed to open the ground, closing the soil instead of breaking it, trapping moisture, choking roots, producing the kind of thin and uneven crop establishment that made a farmer look incompetent, when in fact the incompetence belonged to whoever had failed to understand what was underneath. He knew that the water table in the north fields rose 2 feet in a wet June and stayed there for 3 weeks, and that every new farmer in the valley made the same drainage assumption, and every new farmer in the valley regretted it when the water came up and did not go back down. Clyde knew these things the way he knew his own hands, not because he had studied them, but because he had lived through them. 31 notebooks, 43 years, every frost date, every soil condition, every wet June and dry March and late freeze and early thaw, written down in handwriting that had barely changed since 1979. The year his father sat at the kitchen table, coffee going cold, and told 21-year-old Clyde something that sounded like advice but was really a confession. Dewey Ashgrove had farmed this land for 26 years by then. His back was already beginning to betray him. His hands were the hands of a man who had asked too much of them for too long. He looked at his son and said what he had probably been thinking for years. "The land does not belong to you, son. You belong to the land. The day you forget that, the land will remind you." Dewey died in November of 1994 after his last harvest. Clyde remembered the season better than he remembered the date. It was the year his notebooks got longer, more detailed, more obsessive. As though he was afraid that his father's voice in his head would grow quieter year by year, And if he did not write things down, the knowledge that voice carried would disappear when the voice finally went silent. He walked back to the house as the sky began to brighten. Nadine had coffee on the table. She did not ask where he had been. 40 years of marriage had created a language between them that did not require words for the routine things. Where Clyde went at 5 in the morning was a routine thing. What he found when he got there was occasionally not. He sat down, took the coffee. Nadine sat across from him and opened the local paper, which she still read in print because she said screens made the news feel like it was shouting at her. Martha's granddaughter, Claire, just graduated from the ag program at Iowa State, Nadine said, not looking up from the paper. Smart girl. Reminds me of you at that age, except she probably has better knees. Clyde did not respond immediately. There was a pause, half a second, maybe less, the kind of pause that only a person who had been listening to someone for 4 decades would notice. Then he reached for the sugar. Otis Stovall sold his 600 acres, Clyde said. Nadine looked up. To that new company. Clyde nodded. Nadine's expression was neutral. She had opinions about Otis Stovall's decisions, but she had learned long ago that expressing them before Clyde expressed his was a good way to have a conversation about her opinions instead of the conversation Clyde needed to have about his own. Clyde drank his coffee and said nothing else about it, but his hand had stopped on the cup for half a second when he said Otis's name, and Nadine saw it. He drove to town that morning for feed. The farm supply store on Route 7 had been there longer than Clyde had been farming, which was saying something. The parking lot was half gravel and half intention. Clyde pulled in next to a truck he recognized. Otis Stovall was inside standing at the counter paying for a pallet of fencing supplies. He was 55, 13 years younger than Clyde, a second-generation valley farmer who had grown up on the land his father cleared. Clyde had taught Otis how to read frost signs on grass when Otis was 28 and too proud to ask, but smart enough to watch. They had been neighbors for 30 years. That was worth something. What it was worth was about to be tested. Otis, Clyde said. Clyde, Otis said. They stood in the aisle between the herbicide shelf and the seed display, 2 men who had known each other long enough to skip the pleasantries when something needed to be said. Did you tell them about the clay? Clyde asked. Otis's posture changed, not dramatically, a shift in weight from one foot to the other, the body language of a man who had been expecting this question and had hoped it would not come today. They have a whole survey team, Clyde. They do not need me to tell them. Clyde looked at him. A survey done in a dry March does not find what is sitting 18 inches below the topsoil. Otis's jaw tightened. I am selling land, Clyde, not giving advice. My wife needs surgery. Insurance does not cover enough. You want me to say sorry my dirt has problems, buy it cheaper. Clyde was quiet for a moment. He understood Otis's situation. Linda Stovall had been sick since the fall. The surgery was not optional. 600 acres at the price Harmon Prairie was paying was the difference between getting it done and not getting it done. Clyde would not judge a man for taking care of his wife. He had spent 40 years with a woman who had taken care of him in ways he could not repay, and if it ever came down to selling land or losing Nadine, the land would be gone before sundown. But understanding a choice was not the same as agreeing with it. I just think, Clyde said quietly, if your father were still alive, he would have wanted the buyer to know what that ground needs. Otis looked at Clyde. His face reddened, not with shame exactly, with the particular anger of a man who knows he is hearing the truth from someone who has earned the right to say it and who resents the truth for being true. Otis turned and walked out. The bell above the door rang twice, once when the door opened, once when it closed. Merle Burchard had been standing 3 feet away, examining a hydraulic fitting with the focused attention of a man who was definitely not listening to someone else's conversation. Merle was 42, the valley's only full-time agricultural mechanic. the kind of man who knew every machine in every barn within 20 miles, because he had fixed most of them at least once. That was a little heavy, Clyde Merle said, putting the fitting back on the shelf. I told him the truth. Merle looked at Clyde with the expression of a man who has spent enough years around other men to know that truth and timing are not always the same thing. The truth also has a way of landing softer when you are not standing over a man who just sold his father's land to pay for his wife's surgery. Clyde thought about that all the way home. He thought about it while he checked the fence line on the south section. He thought about it while he ate lunch. He was still thinking about it when Nadine asked him what was wrong, and he said nothing, which was the word Clyde used when something was wrong and he had not finished thinking about it yet. Merle was right. Clyde had been right about the clay. But being right about the clay and being kind about the clay were two different skills, and Clyde was better at one than the other. The convoy appeared on the Valley Road in the third week of February. 3 trucks with the Harmon Prairie Corp logo on the doors, followed by a flatbed carrying prefabricated office panels. Clyde watched them from his morning drive, the way he watched everything without hurry, without comment, with the patient attention of a man who has seen a lot of things arrive in this valley and has outlasted most of them. 3,000 acres. Acquired across the previous 18 months from 9 different landowners, including Otis. A site office assembled in a converted equipment building on the western boundary. A management team of 6 recruited from agricultural universities and agronomy consultancies in the particular ecosystem of people who build careers by optimizing things that other people grow. Merle got hired to maintain their equipment. He was the natural bridge between the two worlds. He told Clyde about the team over coffee at the diner in town. Young, he said, sharp, very professional. The site manager, Dalton Gentry, runs the operation like a military campaign, schedules down to the hour, reports every week. Everything that can be measured gets measured. They know a lot of things, Clyde Merle said, stirring his coffee, but I am not sure they know this valley. Clyde looked out the diner window at the gray February sky. They know the numbers for this valley. That is not the same thing. Merle told him about the lead agronomist, Dr. Mavis Drennan, 31 years old, PhD in crop science. Just finished a project in Nebraska where she improved yield by 18% on a 2,000-acre operation. Smart as they come, Merle said. She looks at a field like she is looking at a math problem. And she is good at math. Clyde did not comment. He knew Nebraska was not Iowa. He knew that a math problem was only as good as the variables you put into it. And he knew that the variables that mattered most in Kendrick Valley were not in any data set that Dr. Mavis Drennan had ever seen. He drove past the site office every morning for 3 weeks. He could see the planting boards through the window, planting schedules, soil maps, input timelines, color-coded, precise. He saw 2 agronomists conducting a drainage assessment in the North Fields on a Tuesday afternoon in March, carrying instruments that probably cost more than Clyde's truck. He saw 3 things that concerned him. The planting date was too early for the valley's frost pocket by 10 days, possibly 2 weeks. The soil preparation plan for the northeast fields was correct for the soil the survey had found, and incorrect for the clay beneath it that the survey had not adequately captured. And the drainage assessment in the North Fields had been conducted in a dry March and was going to produce conclusions that a wet June would contradict in every way that mattered. Clyde was not a man who said nothing when he saw something that needed saying. He had learned from Merle at the feed store that there was a difference between saying the truth and saying it well, and he had been thinking about how to say this well for 2 weeks. Nadine told him he should go. She was right. She was usually right about the things Clyde needed to do and did not want to do. He drove to the site office on a Thursday morning in late March, sat in his truck for 2 minutes before going in. This was the part that surprised him about himself. Clyde Ashgrove was not a man who hesitated. He made decisions the way he planted corn in straight lines without looking back. But he sat in that truck because he knew what was about to happen. He knew the look. He had lived long enough to know what it felt like when a 68-year-old man in an unironed shirt walked into a room full of degrees. He went in. Dalton Gentry received him in the site office with the professional courtesy of a man who knows how to manage local stakeholders. He was 38, MBA from an agricultural business school, the operational confidence of someone who has run large projects before and is running this one with the same tools. He shook Clyde's hand, offered him a seat, had already categorized Clyde before Clyde sat down. Clyde told him what he had observed, plainly, in sequence: the frost pocket, the clay, the drainage. He described the specific field sections. He described what he expected to happen in each if the current approach was maintained. He spoke for about 12 minutes. His voice was steady. His information was precise. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He laid out 43 years of observation the way a man lays out tools on a workbench, each one in its place, each one there for a reason. Dalton listened. He thanked Clyde for coming in. He said the team had conducted thorough surveys and had the valley's conditions well represented in their planning. Dr. Mavis Drennan was sitting at the far table. She'd been watching Clyde since he walked in. 31 years old, 6 years of being the most qualified person in most rooms. A career built on the principle that rigorous methodology produces reliable results, and she was not wrong about that principle. She was just about to discover its limits. She looked at Clyde's shirt, his hands, his 30 years of notebook experience that existed in no format she could cite or cross-reference or plug into a model. She said she appreciated local knowledge, but that the team's assessment methodology was scientifically rigorous and accounted for local variables. Clyde looked at her, not with anger, something closer to sadness, the expression of a man who has seen this exact moment before and knows exactly how it ends. The frost pocket in the north section starts in the 3rd week of April, he said. It has done that every year I have farmed here. It will do it this year. Mavis said the regional forecast data did not indicate unusual frost risk in that period. No, Clyde said, it would not. He stood to leave, and then he saw it. The thing that hurt more than the rejection. Dalton Gentry had turned back to his laptop screen. Not rudely, not deliberately. He had simply finished with this conversation in his mind, somewhere around minute 5, and his body had caught up with his attention. Clyde was still standing in the room, and Dalton was already somewhere else. Clyde realized something in that moment that shocked him more than the dismissal itself. He was not angry because they disagreed with him. He was angry because they had not considered him worth considering. 43 years had just been filed under resolved in 12 minutes, and he felt, and this was the exact word for it, small. That feeling surprised him because he was 68 years old and he had forgotten what small felt like. He had not felt small since he was a young man trying to prove to his father that he could run this farm. And now he felt it again, standing in a room full of people half his age, because a woman with a PhD had looked at him the way people look at furniture. And then the boy at the back of the room spoke. Drew Sutfield, 25 years old, 4 months in the valley, sitting at a desk near the window with a notebook open in front of him. He had been so quiet that Clyde had not registered his presence until the question came. Mr. Ashgrove, how far is the regional weather station from here? Clyde turned, looked at Drew, recognized something immediately the way one man recognizes another man's attention. Drew was not performing interest. He was not managing a stakeholder. He was listening, actually listening. The kind of listening that starts in the eyes and works its way down to the hands which were holding a pen ready to write. 12 miles, Clyde said. On lower ground. Drew nodded, wrote it down. Mavis glanced at Drew. A look. Brief, not hostile, but clear. The look of a senior who has just watched a junior validate an outsider in front of the team. Drew saw it. He understood it. He did not look up. Clyde left. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for 3 minutes, did not start the engine, watched the clouds building in the west. Then he called Nadine. They did not listen, he said. Nadine was quiet for a moment. Are you surprised? No, but I am angry. Silence on the line, the kind of silence that is not empty. There was a boy, Clyde said, his voice dropping half a register, sitting in the back of the room, taking notes in a notebook. Nadine paused, then she said softly, then it is not over yet. Clyde started the truck, drove home. Inside the site office, Drew Sutfield sat at his desk for 2 minutes after everyone else had moved on. Then he opened his notebook to a clean page and wrote 3 lines. Frost pocket 3rd week April. Clay under topsoil northeast fields. Drainage north fields, recheck in wet conditions. He did not show it to Dr. Drennan. He did not show it to Dalton. He closed the notebook and put it in his bag and went back to the soil maps he was supposed to be digitizing. But that night, after the office closed and the team went home, Drew drove out to the north fields alone. He brought a soil thermometer, a simple one, the kind his grandfather used to keep in the tool shed of the small farm in Vermont where Drew had spent every summer until he was 15, the farm his grandfather sold when his knees gave out, the farm that no longer existed except in Drew's memory and in the reason Drew had studied agronomy in the first place. He had gone to school because he wanted to go back to the land, but the only path back he could find was through a corporation. So here he was, 25 years old, an intern, standing in a dark field in Iowa with a thermometer checking the word of a 68-year-old man because something in the way Clyde Ashgrove spoke reminded Drew of the way his grandfather spoke. Not the words, the weight behind them. He measured soil temperature at 5 points across the north section. The low ground near the tree line read 3 degrees Fahrenheit colder than the upper slope 200 yards away. 3 degrees. Enough to make the difference between a frost that kills young plants and a frost that does not reach them. Enough to confirm that the frost pocket Clyde described had a physical basis that the regional weather station 12 miles away on lower ground would never detect. Drew stood in the dark field with his notebook in his hand. He wanted to report this. He thought about Mavis's look in the office, the brief glance that said more than any words about the hierarchy of credibility in a room full of degrees. He thought about what would happen if a 25-year-old intern walked into the morning meeting and said the local farmer was right and the team's frost risk assessment was incomplete. He drove back to his rental, sat at the kitchen table, opened his notebook, wrote 1 line beneath the soil temperature readings. Confirmed temperature differential, not yet reported. He closed the notebook, went to bed, did not sleep well. 2 days later, a call came through to Dalton Gentry's office from Des Moines. Lucille Parnell, 45 years old, head of financial operations for Harmon Prairie Corp's Midwest Division. Her job was to make sure the Kendrick Valley project turned a profit in its first year, and her tools for doing that job were spreadsheets and discipline and the absolute clarity of a person who sees the world in numbers and expects the numbers to behave. The survey budget was 12% over projection, she told Dalton. There is no allocation for supplemental adjustments based on inputs outside the internal assessment framework. Dalton understood. The words meant that even if he wanted to reconsider the planting schedule or the drainage plan or anything else based on what some neighbor had said in the office last Thursday, there was no money to do it. Lucille did not know Clyde Ashgrove existed. She did not need to. Her decision was not about Clyde. It was about a budget line. But it closed a door that was already mostly closed, and now it was locked. That night, Clyde sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open. Nadine stood behind him, reading over his shoulder the way she had been reading over his shoulder for 40 years, which was the only way Clyde let anyone read his notebooks. He wrote in his steady, unhurried handwriting, Harmon Prairie Corporation, 3,000 acres. Planting 10 days early. Do not know about the clay. Do not know about the water. Told them. Did not listen. Nadine read it, looked at him. Do you think they will come back and ask? Clyde shook his head. Then he said something he had not planned to say. His voice was lower than usual. The voice of a man reaching for words he does not normally use because the feelings underneath them are not feelings he normally lets out. Nadine, I sat in that room for 12 minutes and I felt like I did not exist. 43 years, 31 notebooks, and that woman looked at me like I was an old farmer who had come in to tell fairy tales. Nadine put her hand on his. She did not say he was wrong to feel that way. She did not say it would be fine. She said the thing that was true. You are not a fairy tale. Clyde looked at her. I know, he said. But that feeling, I have not felt that since I was 25 and trying to prove to my father I could run this place. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Nadine understood. 40 years had taught her that Clyde Ashgrove said the most when he stopped talking. She squeezed his hand, went to the stove, came back with more coffee. Clyde picked up his pen. He looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then he added 3 more lines at the bottom of the entry. They will lose the crop, and when they lose the crop, they will write a report explaining why. And in that report, there will not be a single line mentioning that a farmer told them exactly what was going to happen 6 months before it happened. He closed the notebook, put the pen on the table, drank his coffee. Outside, the February wind moved across the valley. The fields of Harmon Prairie Corp stretched dark and silent under a sky full of stars that did not care about planting schedules or drainage assessments, or the difference between a regional weather station and the ground truth of a man who had been listening to the same 400 acres for longer than most of the people making decisions about the 3,000 acres next door had been alive. The frost was coming, the clay was waiting, the water would rise. Clyde knew, he had always known. The question was whether anyone would hear him before it was too late. The frost came on the 19th of April, Wednesday, the 3rd week of the month, and it arrived the way Clyde Ashgrove said it would arrive, which is to say without asking permission from the regional forecast data that Dr. Mavis Drennan trusted, and without appearing on any instrument that was not standing in the valley itself at 4 o'clock in the morning when the temperature dropped. Drew Sutfield's alarm went off at 4:15. He had been setting it every night since the 2nd week of April, leafing with the phone on the pillow next to his head, waking each morning to check the weather app, and then going back to sleep when the number said nothing was coming. But Drew had stopped trusting the numbers 3 weeks ago. The numbers came from a station that measured a different piece of ground. The man who measured this piece of ground had told him what was coming, and the man had been right about everything else. He pulled on his boots in the dark, drove to the north fields, got out of the truck, and knew before he reached the first row. The air had that stillness to it, the particular silence of a morning that has done damage and is not sorry about it. The young corn plants in the low section were flattened, not all of them, not the ones on the upper slope, but the ones in the depression where the cold air pooled and settled and stayed. The ones that had been planted 10 days too early for this specific piece of ground, those plants were done. Their leaves had gone translucent at the edges. The cellular structure was already collapsing. By noon, they would be brown. By tomorrow, they would be mulch. Drew knelt in the dirt, touched a damaged plant with his fingers, felt the softness where there should have been resistance. He had studied frost damage in textbooks. He had seen photographs. He had written a paper on cold stress in his second year of graduate school. None of that had prepared him for the feeling of holding a dead plant that did not have to die. He took photographs, 8 of them, measured soil temperature at 8 points, wrote the numbers in his notebook. Then he stood in the middle of the damaged field and looked east across the fence line to Clyde Ashgrove's 400 acres. Clyde's corn was not in the ground yet. Clyde's north section was bare, waiting, because Clyde knew what April did in this valley, and Clyde had not planted yet because Clyde did not plant until the valley told him it was safe. Drew drove back to his rental, opened his laptop, wrote an email to Mavis Drennan, attached the photographs, included the temperature data, added one line at the bottom, consistent with Mr. Ashgrove's warning in March. He sent it at 5:12 in the morning. Mavis read it at 6. She did not reply. By 7, she was in the field. Drew watched her from the office window. She stood at the edge of the damaged section for 5 minutes, motionless, her hands at her sides. He had never seen her stand still for that long. Mavis Drennan was a woman who moved through the world with purpose and velocity. Standing still was not something she did, but she stood still now, looking at the damage, and Drew understood that she was not just seeing dead corn. She was seeing the first crack at something she had built her entire career on. She came back to the office and began writing the damage report. Drew read it 2 hours later when it was circulated to the team. The report was thorough. It was precise. It identified the cause as localized frost conditions outside the range of regional forecast data. It recommended supplemental monitoring for microclimate variation. It was by every technical standard an excellent piece of work. It did not mention Clyde Ashgrove. It did not mention Drew's email. It did not mention that a man had walked into this office 4 weeks ago and described in specific and accurate detail exactly what had just happened and exactly where it would happen. Drew read the report twice. Then he stood up and walked to Mavis's desk. She looked up. She knew why he was there. He could see it in the way her posture shifted a fraction of an inch backward, the body preparing for a conversation the mind had already decided how to handle. The report does not mention that we were warned, Drew said. Mavis's voice was controlled, measured, the voice of someone who has rehearsed their answer. The report documents the meteorological cause. That is what is technically relevant. Drew did not move. But if we document that there was a prior warning, Mavis cut him off, not sharply, precisely. Drew, if I write in this report that a local farmer predicted exactly what our entire team failed to anticipate, what do you think happens? Not to me, to the project, to the budget for next season, to the 5 other people in this room who need this operation to continue. Drew stood there. For the first time since he had started working under her, he saw Mavis Drennan not as the confident authority who had dismissed Clyde in March, but as someone carrying a weight he had not considered. She was not hiding Clyde's warning out of arrogance. She was hiding it out of calculation. The wrong calculation, Drew believed, but not a stupid one. He left her desk, sat in his truck during lunch, opened his notebook, wrote warning accurate, not documented, reasons more complicated than I thought. 3 miles away, Clyde Ashgrove stood at the fence line that separated his property from Harmon Prairie's north section. He could see the damage, the brown streaks in the green, the gaps where plants should have been standing and were not. He had seen this before. He had caused this before once in 1989, when he planted a week too early and paid for it with 30% of his north section crop. He learned, he wrote it down, he never did it again. He did not drive to the site office. He did not call. He stood at the fence line and looked at 3,000 acres that he knew how to save and was not allowed to save, and he felt something that had been building since the morning in March when Dalton Gentry turned back to his laptop while Clyde was still talking. It was not anger. Anger was too clean a word for it. It was the feeling of carrying knowledge that no one wanted, of being full of answers to questions that no one was asking, of watching preventable damage happen from 50 yards away with a fence between you and the solution. Nadine called at noon. Are you coming home for lunch? Yes. She paused. You saw it. Yes. Another pause. You are not going to tell them. Clyde watched a meadowlark settle on the fence post. It sang 2 notes and flew away. This time they have to see it for themselves, he said. At the farm supply store that afternoon, Merle Burchard was waiting for Drew. Not by arrangement. Merle had a way of being in the right place when something needed to be said. The natural positioning of a man who spent his working life moving between machines and the people who operated them. I heard Ashgrove called the frost, Merle said, leaning against the parts counter. Drew looked at him. He also called the clay, Merle said. And the water? I have been in this valley 20 years, Drew. Not as long as Clyde, but long enough to know he is not guessing. You should prepare yourself for what is coming in May and June. Drew nodded. He had already begun preparing himself. But hearing Merle say it made the weight of it land differently, because Merle was not a farmer with notebooks and not a PhD with instruments. Merle was a mechanic who fixed what broke, and if Merle was worried about what was going to break next, then what was going to break next was real. May came in wet. The rain started on the 5th and did not stop. The crew prepared the northeast fields on the 12th, following the plan that Mavis had designed based on the soil survey from March, a survey that had accurately mapped the topsoil and had not gone deep enough to find what was underneath. Drew drove out to the northeast section the morning after preparation. He walked the rows. The ground was wrong. He could see it before he knelt down. The surface had a sheen to it, a sealed quality like skin that has closed over a wound instead of healing beneath it. Water pooled in the wheel tracks instead of draining away. He pushed a spade into the earth and hit resistance at 16 inches. The blade would not go deeper. He pulled it out and looked at the compacted layer on the steel. Gray, dense, slick. The clay had done exactly what Clyde said it would do in a wet spring. The preparation equipment had pressed it into a barrier that roots could not penetrate and water could not pass through. He did not report it to Mavis, not yet. Instead, he did something that would change the course of his career and the course of this story. He drove to Clyde Ashgrove's house. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Nadine was in the spare bedroom teaching a neighbor's daughter long division. Drew could hear her voice through the wall, patient and clear, the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years explaining things to people who did not understand them yet and had never once lost her patience in the process. Clyde was at the kitchen table. He looked up when Drew knocked on the screen door and did not look surprised. "Come in," he said. Drew sat down, opened his notebook to the 3 lines he had written in March, put it on the table between them. Clyde looked at the 3 lines for a long time, not reading them exactly, recognizing them, the way a man recognizes his own words written in someone else's hand. Then he stood up, went into the back room, came out carrying a notebook with a green cover faded with age, the corners soft from handling. He opened it to a page near the middle, turned it so Drew could read. The handwriting was the same as Clyde's current notebooks, slightly tighter, the pen pressure heavier, a younger man's hand. The entry was dated May 1993. It read, "Northeast, prepared soil in wet conditions, clay compacted, lost 40% of seedlings." Clyde had made this exact mistake 29 years ago, on this exact ground, in this exact kind of spring, and he had learned from it the only way a man learns from the land, which is by paying for the lesson and writing it down so he never has to pay for it again. Drew stared at the page. He felt something shift inside him. Something about the way he understood knowledge and where it came from and what it was worth. A PhD took 6 years. This notebook had taken 43, and the notebook was more right. Drew looked up at Clyde. There was a question he had been carrying since the morning of the frost, a question that had been growing in the back of his mind as he watched the gap between what Clyde knew and what the team believed widen into something that looked more and more like a disaster. "Mr. Ashgrove, have you ever been wrong?" Clyde did not look toward the bedroom where Nadine was teaching. She was not there to tell the story for him. This time, for the first time in the story, Clyde told it himself. 1987, he said, "I missed the signs of a late drought because I was distracted by a boundary lawsuit with a neighbor. Lost nearly the entire crop. Bank gave me one more season. Nadine taught night school math to make the interest payments." He paused, looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had held this soil 10,000 times. "That is the year I started the notebooks," he said, "not because I wanted to be scientific, because I was afraid. Afraid that if I did not write it down, I would forget. And if I forgot, I would lose everything again." Then he said something that Drew did not expect, something that came from a place deeper than expertise, deeper than 43 years of observation, from the place where a man keeps the things he does not say out loud because saying them would make them too real. "Drew, I am 68 years old. I have no children. This farm will be sold when I am gone. These 31 notebooks, no one will ever read them. Everything I know about this valley will disappear with me. And last month I sat in that office for 12 minutes, and that woman looked at me like I had already disappeared." Drew did not speak. He sat at the table and felt the weight of those words settle over the room. Because he understood now. The notebooks were not a hobby. They were not amateur science. They were the desperate act of a man trying to leave a mark on the land he loved more than anything, while knowing that no one was coming after him to read what he had written. In the other room, Nadine's voice continued calm and steady, explaining how to carry the remainder. The most ordinary sound in the world. The sound of knowledge being passed from someone who had it to someone who needed it. Which was Drew realized exactly what was happening at this kitchen table. He opened his notebook, began to write. The rains continued. The northeast fields produced a thin, uneven stand, but the worst was still coming. Lucille Parnell flew in from Des Moines on the first Tuesday of June. She arrived in a rental car and walked into the site office with the energy of a woman who has read numbers she does not like and intends to find out whose fault the numbers are. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Dalton presented the frost damage assessment, softening the language in ways that did not quite disguise the scale of the loss. Mavis presented the soil data, clinical and precise. Lucille listened to all of it, then asked one question that silenced the room. "I do not need to know why the weather was bad. I need to know why 6 people with doctoral degrees did not anticipate a frost event in April in Iowa." No one mentioned Clyde. Drew sat in the corner. He wanted to speak. He looked at Mavis. She did not look back. He stayed quiet. Lucille made her decision. 15% cut to the mid-season adjustment budget, the money that might have been used to deep till the northeast fields, the money that might have been used to redesign the drainage in the north section. Gone. Not because Lucille was cruel, because the numbers required it, and Lucille lived by the numbers the way Clyde lived by the notebooks. The difference was that the numbers only knew what you told them, and no one had told these numbers about the clay or the water. 3 weeks of above-average rainfall in June. The water table in the North Fields rose to exactly the level Clyde had described to Dalton Gentry 3 months earlier. 300 acres saturated at the critical growth stage. Corn standing in water that was not going anywhere for 3 weeks. Drew called Clyde at 6 in the morning, did not ask for advice, asked for instructions. Mr. Ashgrove, if this were your land, what would you do right now with those 300 acres? Clyde was quiet for 10 seconds. Drew counted them. You cannot save those 300 acres, Drew. The water will stay for 3 weeks. But the southwest edge of that section sits 8 inches lower than the ground beside it. If you cut a drainage channel along that edge, the water from the adjacent 80 acres will have somewhere to go. You will not save the 300, but you will save the 80 next to them. Drew hung up, called Merle Burchard. Merle called a farmer 3 miles south whom Clyde had named. The farmer brought a small excavator. By 7 the next morning, Drew and Merle and the borrowed machine were cutting a drainage channel along the southwest boundary of the flooded section. They did not ask Dalton Gentry for permission. They did not file a work order. They did not wait. Dalton found out at noon. He drove to the north fields and saw the channel and the excavator, and Drew standing in mud up to his shins, and Merle Burchard operating a machine that did not belong to the company on ground that the company owned. The confrontation happened in the field. Not in the office, in the field, with water standing in the rows behind them and the sound of the excavator still running because Merle had not turned it off. Who authorized this? Dalton said. Drew looked at him, the look of a man who has crossed a line and knows it and is not going back. I called Mr. Ashgrove. He told me where to cut. Dalton's voice went flat. You called the neighbor before you called your manager. Drew did not flinch. The 80 acres adjacent to the flood zone were going under. By tomorrow, they would have been saturated. Mr. Ashgrove knew where the water would go and how to redirect it. I did not have time to file paperwork. Mavis was there. She had driven out behind Dalton. She stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, looking at the drainage channel that Drew and Merle had cut. She could see the water already beginning to move. It was working. The 80 acres on the other side of the channel were draining. Drew was right. Ashgrove was right. The channel was right. She did not say any of this. Dalton turned to Merle. You are a maintenance technician, not a drainage engineer. Merle shut off the excavator, climbed down, stood in the mud with his boots sinking, and looked at Dalton with the calm, unimpressed expression of a man who has been in this valley long enough to know who understands it and who does not. I am a mechanic, Merle said, but I have also lived in this valley for 20 years. And when the water comes up, you do not need an engineer. You need someone who knows where the water goes. Dalton stared at him. Next time, Merle said, you listen to Ashgrove first. Then nobody needs to ask permission. Drew received a formal written warning that afternoon. Unauthorized use of equipment, unauthorized modification of field drainage, insubordination. The word insubordination appeared twice in the document. Drew signed it, put it in his bag, did not argue. That evening, he sat in his truck outside his rental house. The sun was going down. His boots were still caked with mud from the north fields. He opened his notebook, wrote formal warning, 80 acres saved, worth it. Then he turned back to the first page. The line he had written 4 months ago when he arrived in the valley, full of the quiet hope of a young man who believed that paying attention was the most important skill a person could have. Learn everything you can learn, he underlined it. July, the damage was done. The frost had taken the early plantings. The clay had choked the northeast fields. The water had drowned the north section. 3 separate failures, 3 separate causes, all 3 described by one man in one 12-minute conversation in one site office in late March. All 3 ignored. Otis Stovall came to Clyde's house on a Thursday evening in the middle of the month, unannounced. He parked in the driveway and sat in his truck for a minute before getting out the way a man sits when he is deciding what to say and whether he has the courage to say it. Clyde saw him from the kitchen window, walked out to the porch, did not go to the truck, waited, let Otis come to him. They sat on the porch steps, not the kitchen table. The evening was warm. Fireflies were starting up in the tree line. Nadine brought out 2 glasses of water and went back inside without a word. Linda is better, Otis said. Surgery went well. She is home. Clyde nodded. Good. Silence. Crickets. The sound of a tractor running somewhere far across the valley, someone else's field, someone else's evening work. I drive past my land every day, Otis said. My father's land, and I see the corn dying in the north section, standing in water, on ground my father drained by hand in 1972 with a shovel and a transit level. Clyde listened. I should have told them, Otis said, about the clay, about the water. I knew. I grew up on that dirt. Clyde did not say I told you so. He had been thinking about what Merle said in the feed store 3 months ago about truth and timing and softness. He had been thinking about it more than he expected to. You did what you had to do for your family, Clyde said. I will not judge you for that. Otis looked at him. But you were right at the store that day about what my father would have wanted. Clyde looked out at the valley. The light was doing that thing it did in July, turning the fields gold at the edges while the center held green. He thought about Dewey Ashgrove. He thought about Otis's father, Dale Stovall, who had been Dewey's friend and had helped Dewey pour the foundation of the barn that still stood on Clyde's property. I was right about the land, Clyde said. Merle was right about how I said it. I should have been gentler. Otis was quiet for a while. Then he said what he had come to say. They did not listen to you, Clyde. Why would they listen to me? Clyde turned and looked at him. Because now they are losing money. September. Harvest. 3,000 acres of Kendrick Valley corn moved through the combines and produced a yield that was 41% below projection. Not a natural disaster number, not a weather event number, a number that belonged to decisions. Decisions made by qualified people with excellent educations who had not known the ground they were making decisions about. Drew walked behind the combine in the north section on the second day of harvest. He bent down, picked up an ear of corn that the machine had missed. It was small, underdeveloped. He squeezed it and felt the kernels give way soft and hollow where they should have been firm and full. He held it in his hand and looked across the fence. Clyde's 400 acres had been harvested the week before. Clean rows, even stubble. The kind of field that looks like someone cared about it because someone had. Same valley, same weather, same rain, same frost, same sun, different result. Because one piece of ground was farmed by the man who knew it, and the other was farmed by people who knew about it. And those were not the same thing. On the other side of the fence, Clyde stood watching. He had been there for 10 minutes, not gloating. There was no satisfaction in his face. His expression was the one he had worn the day they buried his father. The expression of a man watching something valuable disappear and knowing that no amount of knowledge or care or shouting could have stopped it because the people who could have stopped it chose not to listen. Nadine called him in for supper. He stood for 1 more minute. Then he turned and walked back to the house. The next morning, a car that did not belong to the valley appeared on the road. A rental, black, clean. It turned into the Harmon Prairie site office lot, and a man got out who moved differently from the people who usually move through that office. He was not young. He was not in a hurry. He had the specific gravity of someone who has been in rooms where large decisions are made and has been the one making them. Grady Caulfield, 58 years old, regional vice president, 20 years in agricultural investment. A man who had developed across those 20 years a highly refined ability to tell the difference between a problem caused by bad luck and a problem caused by bad judgment. He had read the post-mortem reports on the flight from Chicago. He had read the contributing factors. He had read between the lines, which was where the real contributing factors usually lived. He sat in the conference room for 3 hours, asked questions that the reports did not answer, looked at data that confirmed what the data had predicted and data that contradicted what the data had predicted, and noticed that the contradictions all clustered in the same three areas: the north section, the northeast fields, the drainage zones. He asked Dalton Gentry a question that Dalton had not prepared for. Who are our neighbors? Dalton mentioned several names. He mentioned Clyde. He mentioned the visit in March. He did not mention it the way a man mentions something he considers important. He mentioned it the way a man mentions something he has already decided was not important, which is to say quickly with the verbal equivalent of a shrug. Grady Caulfield did not shrug. Was anyone else aware of that visit, he asked. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when a question lands on a table and no one wants to be the first to pick it up. Drew Sutfield raised his hand. Grady looked at him. "Show me your notebook," he said. Drew opened it, turned to the page. 3 lines, written in late March in a 25-year-old's handwriting in the back of a room where no one else had been listening. Frost pocket, 3rd week April. Clay under topsoil, northeast fields. Drainage, north fields, recheck in wet conditions. Grady Caulfield read the 3 lines. Then he read them again. Then he looked at the post-mortem report sitting on the table in front of him, 47 pages produced by 6 qualified agronomists after 6 months of failure. And he saw that 3 lines in a young man's notebook had said everything that 47 pages were trying to explain. He looked at the notebook for a long time. The room waited. Then he closed it, handed it back to Drew, and said 5 words. "Take me to see him." Drew drove. Grady Caulfield sat in the passenger seat and did not speak. The road from the site office to Clyde Ashgrove's property was 4 minutes long past the north fields where the harvest machines had left tracks in soil that was still recovering from a season of being misunderstood, past the fence line where the difference between the 2 operations was visible even now, weeks after the last ear had been pulled. 4 minutes, long enough for Grady to notice that the young man driving was gripping the steering wheel with both hands and had not blinked in 30 seconds. "You are nervous," Grady said. Drew glanced at him. "A little." "Why?" "Because you are about to meet the most important person in this valley, and he does not know it yet." Grady looked at Drew for a yes moment. Then he looked forward at the road at the property coming into view. A white farmhouse, a red barn with a roof that had been patched more than once, a mailbox with the name Ashgrove in letters that had faded but not disappeared, the house of a man who had maintained things instead of replacing them, which told Grady more about Clyde Ashgrove's character than any resume ever could. Nadine opened the door. She looked at Grady the way she looked at everything, with the calm assessment of a woman who had been a teacher for 30 years and could read a room before the room knew it was being read. She saw the rental car. She saw the posture. She saw the shoes, which were not farm shoes. She understood immediately that this was not Dalton Gentry. This was not a man who managed stakeholders. This was a man who made decisions, and he had come to her kitchen to make one. "Come in," she said. "I will put coffee on." Clyde was at the table. He had seen the car pull in. He had expected this visit the way he expected the frost in April, not because anyone had told him it was coming, but because 43 years of paying attention had taught him the patterns of how things worked. And one of those patterns was that organizations did not send senior people to visit neighbors unless something had gone badly enough to make the neighbors relevant. He stood when Grady entered, shook his hand, sat back down. Nadine brought coffee, black for Clyde. She asked Grady how he took his, and he said black, which was either true or diplomatic, and either way, Nadine approved. Grady did not introduce himself with his title. He said his name. He sat down. And then he did something that Clyde had not experienced in the site office in March and had not expected to experience from anyone associated with Harmon Prairie Corp. He was quiet. For 5 full minutes, Grady Caulfield sat at Clyde Ashgrove's kitchen table and did not say a word. He drank his coffee. He looked at the kitchen, at the calendar on the wall with planting dates circled in pencil, at the window that faced the north fields, at the man sitting across from him, 68 years old, unironed, shirt hands that had been in this valley's soil more times than anyone could count. Grady was not being polite. He was not being strategic. He was doing something rarer than either of those things. He was making space. He was telling Clyde without saying it that this room belonged to Clyde, and whatever happened next would happen at Clyde's pace, in Clyde's words, on Clyde's terms. Clyde recognized it, the way one man recognizes another man's respect, not the performed kind, the real kind, the kind that starts with shutting up. He began to talk. He talked about the valley, not the data version, not the survey version, the lived version. He talked about how the cold air moved through the north section in April, lighting down the slope like water, finding the lowest point, pooling in the depression near the tree line where the ground dipped just enough to hold it. He talked about the northeast fields and what they needed in a wet year and what they punished you for if you did not give it to them. He talked about the water and where it went and how long it stayed and what it did to a crop that was trying to grow above it. He talked for 20 minutes. Drew wrote without stopping. Grady listened the way he had been listening for 20 years in rooms where the most important information was usually the quietest, where the person who knew the most was rarely the person talking the loudest. Then Clyde stood up and left the room. He came back carrying a cardboard box. He set it on the table and opened it and took out the notebooks. All 31 of them. He laid them on the table the way a man lays out evidence, not to prove his innocence, but to prove his existence, to show that he had been here, that he had been paying attention, that the 43 years he had spent on this ground had produced something that mattered, even if the something did not have a title page or a peer review or a citation format. He opened the earliest one, 1979. The handwriting was tighter than the pen pressure, heavier. A young man's hand pressing hard because the act of writing still felt urgent, because Dewey Ashgrove had only been gone 5 years, and the fear of forgetting was still fresh. He turned the pages, showed Grady the April entries, the May entries, the June entries, year after year, the frost dates consistent within a 5-day window across 4 decades. The soil notes tracking exactly when preparation worked and when it did not. The drainage observations charting where the water moved and when and for how long. Grady read. He did not skim. He read the way a man reads a document that changes his understanding of something he thought he already understood. Nadine sat nearby. She had been watching Clyde show these notebooks to very few people in 43 years. She had watched him write in them. She had watched him close them. She had never watched him open them for a stranger with this much writing on whether the stranger understood what he was looking at. She said one thing, not about the notebooks, not about the data they contained, about the night they began. He started the first one at this table, she said. 3 in the morning, November 1979. I got up and made coffee. He did not look up. He wrote until dawn. One sentence. It told Grady everything a post-mortem report could not. That these notebooks were not a project. They were a response to loss. A man writing in the dark because he was afraid of what would happen if he stopped. Drew's pen kept moving. Grady closed the notebook he was holding, looked at the stack on the table, looked at Clyde. What would it take, he said, for us to have access to this knowledge on a formal basis? Clyde had been thinking about this question since March, not because he expected it from Grady specifically, but because he was 68 years old and he had been thinking about what would happen to what he knew when he was no longer around to know it. The notebooks would survive him, but notebooks without a reader are just paper. What he carried in his hands and his eyes and his memory of 43 April mornings that would die with him unless someone was there to receive it while he was still alive to give it. He named a figure. It was modest, the kind of number a man names when he is not selling his knowledge but offering it when the money is less important than the principle that what he knows has value and that someone is willing to say so out loud. Grady did not negotiate. He said the figure was fair. He meant it. He had spent 20 years buying expertise from people with credentials and offices and slide presentations, and he had never bought anything as valuable as what was sitting on this kitchen table in a cardboard box. One condition, Clyde said. Grady looked at him. You listen. Not the way Dalton listened in March. Actually listen. The room was still. Nadine's hand resting on the back of Clyde's chair tightened by a fraction of an inch. Drew stopped writing. The coffee maker on the counter made a small sound, the kind of mechanical sigh that machines make when they are doing exactly what they were built to do. Grady looked at Clyde steadily, without defensiveness, without performance, with the expression of a man who has sat across from enough people in enough rooms to know when he is being tested and when he is being trusted, and who understood that Clyde was doing the second thing, which was harder and more important. That is why I am sitting at your kitchen table, Grady said, instead of asking Dalton to call you. Clyde looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he nodded, picked up his coffee, took a drink. All right, he said. Let us start with the North Fields. They talked for 2 hours. Nadine refilled the coffee twice. At one point, Clyde asked Drew to get a piece of paper from the printer in the spare room, and when Drew came back, Clyde took a pencil and began to draw. The frost pocket, its boundaries, its depth, the way it shifted in years when the wind came from the northwest versus the west. He drew it from memory the way a man draws a map of his own home, without measuring, without pausing, because the dimensions lived inside him. Drew asked him to sign it. Clyde looked at him like the request was strange, then signed it in the bottom corner, his name and the date. A Tuesday afternoon in October. When they left, Nadine walked them to the door. She touched Clyde's shoulder as they passed. 1 second, a gesture so small it barely existed. Drew saw it. Grady saw it. Neither mentioned it, but both understood what it meant. That 43 years of knowledge did not live only in 31 notebooks. It lived in the space between two people who had built a life on this land season by season, year by year, without a child to carry it forward, and who were now finally being asked to share it with someone who wanted to learn. Drew wrote in his notebook that evening, sitting at the desk in his rental house, with the light from the parking lot coming through the window. He did not write data, he wrote 7 words. He was not selling knowledge, he found a listener. Before the second season began, Grady made 2 decisions that changed the trajectory of the operation. The first was structural. The planting schedule for the frost-sensitive sections was pushed back 10 days. The northeast fields were deep-tilled to break the compacted layer before spring preparation. The drainage system in the north section was redesigned according to Clyde's description of how the water moved and where it needed to go. The second decision was personal. Grady hired Drew Sutfield full-time, not as an agronomist, as something new, something that did not have a name in the corporate hierarchy because no one had thought to create the position before. Drew's job was to spend as much time with Clyde as Clyde would allow and to write everything down. Drew did not need to be told twice. 3 mornings a week he drove to Clyde's house at 6. They walked the fields together. Clyde did not lecture. He did not explain in the way that textbooks explain, with definitions and principles and diagrams. He taught by pointing, by stopping, by kneeling in the dirt and saying, "Look at this, do you see it?" And Drew would kneel beside him and look, and sometimes he would see it, and sometimes he would not. And when he did not, Clyde would wait until he did. Merle Burchard started joining them on Saturday mornings. Nobody asked him to. He just showed up. He knew the land differently from Clyde. He knew it through the machines. He knew which parts of which fields bogged down the tractors in spring because the soil held water differently there. He knew where the subsoil rocks sat because he had replaced the blades they broke. His knowledge was not the same as Clyde's. It was adjacent, complementary. And when the three of them walked together, Clyde reading the soil and Merle reading the machine, wear patterns, and Drew writing it all down, they assembled a picture of the valley that no satellite image and no PhD thesis and no corporate survey had ever captured. The thing about Mavis Drennan was that she was not fired. Grady kept her, and the reason he kept her was precise. Her methodology was not wrong. Her science was not wrong. Her analysis of the Nebraska project had been genuinely excellent, and her work on the Kendrick Valley data, once the data was correct, was as sharp as anything Grady had seen from at any level of the organization. What had failed was not her ability. It was her frame. She had built a career inside a frame that did not include the possibility that a man with no degree and no publication record and no institutional affiliation could possess information that her instruments could not detect. The frame was not broken. It was incomplete. And the difference between a broken tool and an incomplete tool is that you throw away the first one and you add to the second one. She began adding, not dramatically, not with a speech or a confession or a tearful apology. Mavis Drennan was not that kind of person, and this is not that kind of story. She added the way that scientists add. She adjusted the variable. She altered the input. She began asking Drew before making decisions about any specific field section what Clyde had said about that section. She began cross-referencing her models with Clyde's observations. She began treating the notebooks not as local color, but as a data source. A 43-year longitudinal data set with daily observations maintained by a single consistent observer, covering microclimate soil behavior and hydrology at a resolution that no institutional study had ever matched. The morning that mattered came in April of the second year. Clyde arrived at the site office at 7:30 the way he had been arriving 3 mornings a week since October. He drank their coffee, he looked at their screens, and Mavis Drennan put a planting map in front of him and said 6 words that cost her more than anyone in the room would ever know. "Mr. Ashgrove, I need you to check this." It was not an apology. Mavis Drennan did not apologize the way other people apologized. She apologized by changing her behavior, by treating the knowledge she had dismissed in March as the knowledge she could not do without in April. The map she put in front of Clyde was her way of saying, "I was wrong," without saying the words, because saying the words would have required her to revisit the moment in the office when she had looked at his hands and his shirt and his 30 years of unformatted expertise and had decided in the time it takes to form a judgment that none of it met her standard of evidence. Clyde understood. He sat down, studied the map, traced the boundaries of the north section with his finger, found the issue. "Move the planting date back 3 more days in the northeast corner of the north section," he said. "The frost holds there longer than anywhere else. The tree line blocks the morning sun. The ground stays cold 2 days after the rest of the section has warmed." Mavis made the adjustment right there, in front of him, with her pen on his map. A small act that said more than any words, "I am listening." After Clyde left the office that morning, Mavis sat at her desk for a minute. Drew was nearby filing soil reports. She spoke without looking up. Do you know what the hardest part is? It is not admitting he was right. It is admitting that I had the chance to listen in March and I chose not to. Not because I did not believe him, because I was afraid that believing him meant that everything I had been trained to do was not enough. Drew did not respond. He wrote it in his notebook, not because it was data, because it was the truth and the truth deserved to be recorded, and the notebooks had taught him that. Later that day, Merle Burchard found Drew in the parking lot. Dr. Drennan asked Clyde to check the planning map, Drew said. Merle smiled, the first genuine smile Drew had seen from him since the season started. It reached his eyes. Cost 41% of a season to buy that lesson, Merle said. Expensive, but at least they learn. Otis Stovall started coming to the site office one morning a week. No one invited him. No one paid him. He simply arrived. He knew his former land the way only a man can know ground he was born on. And now that someone wanted that knowledge, he found that he wanted to give it. He and Clyde sat at the same table in the office, two farmers among the satellite maps and digital yield projections, and the valley had its voice back. One morning in May, Clyde and Otis walked the northeast fields together. The ground that used to be Otis's father's ground. The deep tilling had broken the compacted layer. The spring preparation had been timed for the right moisture conditions. The crop was coming up even and strong, the rows straight, the color that particular shade of green that tells a farmer everything is working the way it is supposed to work. Otis stopped walking, looked at the rows, touched a young plant with his hand the way a man touches something he thought he had lost. I should have told them from the beginning, he said, about the clay, about the water. Clyde walked beside him. He had been thinking about Merle's words from the feed store for over a year now, turning them over the way he turned soil looking for what was underneath. You did what you had to do for your family, Clyde said. I will never judge you for that. Otis looked at him. But you were right, at the store that day, about what my father would have wanted. Clyde looked at the field. Dale Stovall had cleared this ground by hand. Dewey Ashgrove had helped him pour the foundation of the barn that still stood on Clyde's property. Two men, two friends, two pieces of the same valley. Gone now. But what they knew was not gone. Not yet. I was right about the land, Clyde said. Merle was right about how I said it. I should have been gentler. They walked in silence after that. Two men on ground that held the memory of their fathers under a sky that did not care about pride or regret, through a crop that was growing the way it was supposed to grow. Because finally, after one season of loss and one winter of learning, the people farming this land had started listening to the land. The second harvest came in September. 3,000 acres produced a yield that was 31% above the revised projection. Not a record. Not exceptional. Just what good Kendrick Valley ground produced when it was farmed the way it needed to be farmed, which was to say the way Clyde had been farming his 400 acres for 43 years with knowledge that could not be bought at a university and could not be found in a database and could not be generated by any instrument more sophisticated than a man kneeling in the dirt with a notebook and the patience to do it again tomorrow. Clyde drove to the site office 3 mornings a week. He drank their coffee. He looked at their data and told them what the data was not showing them that the valley was showing him. He walked the fields in April and read the frost signs, and in May read the soil, and in June watched the water and told them what he saw. He kept his notebooks. He kept his farm. He kept his morning drive past the site office where the planning boards in the window now displayed alongside the yield projections and the input schedules, a hand-drawn map of the valley's frost pocket in Clyde Ashgrove's handwriting, signed in the bottom corner with his name and the date from a Tuesday afternoon when Drew had asked him to draw it. Nobody laughed at the old farmer. They had learned at a cost that could be calculated in dollars and measured in lost yield, and felt in the particular shame of people who had been given an answer and had thrown it away, that the most valuable knowledge on that farm did not have a degree. It did not come from a university. It could not be found in any report that any team of qualified agronomists had ever produced about the Kendrick Valley. It came in every morning at 7:30 and drank black coffee and had 31 notebooks and the unhurried patience of a man who had been paying attention to the right things for long enough to know what the right things were. On an evening in late October, after the harvest was done and the fields were resting and the valley was settling into the particular stillness that comes between the end of one season and the beginning of the next, Drew Sutfield sat at his desk in his rental house. The lamp was on. The window was dark. He could hear the wind outside moving across the valley, the way the wind had always moved across the valley, carrying the cold down from the north, following the same paths it had followed for 1,000 years before any Ashgrove or Stovall or Sutfield or anyone else had arrived to notice. He opened a new notebook, his second. The first one was full, every page front and back, data, observations, conversations, diagrams Clyde had drawn for him on napkins and scrap paper. Notes from mornings in the field when Clyde had stopped walking and pointed at something in the soil and said 3 words that contained more information than a semester of coursework. Drew turned to the first page of the new notebook. Blank, clean, waiting. He wrote at the top in handwriting that was beginning to look like something permanent, notebook number 2, Kendrick Valley. Then beneath it, he wrote the words that Clyde had said to him that morning when they were walking the north fields together and Drew had asked him a question that he had been carrying for months. The question was simple. The answer was not. Mr. Ashgrove, how do you know when you have learned enough? Clyde had stopped walking, looked at the field, looked at the sky, looked at Drew with the expression of a man who has been asked the right question by the right person at the right time. You never know enough, Clyde said. You just know more than you did yesterday. Drew wrote it down, closed the notebook, put the pen on the desk, sat for a moment in the quiet of the room, in the quiet of the valley, in the quiet of a life that had just begun to pay attention. 31 notebooks, 43 years, one man's lifetime of listening to the same 400 acres of ground. And now in a rented house at the edge of the Kendrick Valley,